Hello and welcome to our Coaching Excellence webinar on practice planning and delivery. I'm Corey Edington, the CEO and co-founder of Athlete Era, and during today's free 25-minute webinar, I'm going to show you an evidence-based approach for planning and delivering great practices for kids between the ages of 5 to 12. Now, whether you're brand new to coaching or you've been coaching for a few years, this is an absolute must-watch webinar if you're really hoping to maximize player skill development, engagement, and fun during your practices. Now, in order to help you do this, we're going to cover three main topics. The topics we're going to go into are how to structure your plan, how to choose great activities to run during your practice, and how to deliver great coaching once you hit the field or the court. Now, following this webinar, be sure to download the Athlete Era app for your sport and sign up to access more resources and tools that make delivering great coaching easy. So now let's get into the webinar. After completing my master's degree in exercise and sports science, I went on to co-found Athlete Era in 2018, and since that time, we've had the privilege of working with multiple national sport governing bodies, international research groups, and professional sports organizations on how we can improve coaching at the youth level. Now, through that process, I've reviewed multiple long-term athlete development models and hundreds of coaching documents and really helped get that information out into the hands of 40,000 coaches. And that's why I'm really excited today to be able to empower you with some of the most valuable things I've learned. Now, I want to start off by really discussing how we approach practice with a focus on long-term athlete development, because this is a little bit different from the competition focus a lot of coaches still utilize today. So what it really means to focus on long-term athlete development is that when we approach practice, we're really thinking, how can we maximize the technical and tactical skill acquisition of every single player on our team, and also create an environment in which sport is fun and enjoyable for kids, because this keeps them coming back. When we approach practice through a competition mindset, we're really focusing on how can we win the next game and doing things that are a little bit more focused on the short-term success of our team rather than the long-term success of every single athlete that we're working with. Now, even though this is quite new, there's a lot of evidence out there to support that this approach is effective, not only in helping retain more players, but also performing better as an adult. Let's look at Norway for an example of this. Norway has made a lot of shifts as of late to really de-emphasize competition within their sports system. So they've done things like, no longer keep score of games and league standings. So what this does is really helps coaches focus more on development rather than competition. And the results of this have been quite amazing. Norway actually now has one of the highest levels of youth sport participation in the world. And when it comes to high performance, they've won the last two Winter Olympics, and what really makes this impressive is they've done so with a population of only 5.3 million people, which is roughly the same size as Colorado. Now, if we want to actually focus on development, how we approach and plan for practice is absolutely critical. So now let's get into how you actually structure your practice plans. Putting together a plan helps us do two important things as coaches. It helps us organize what we want players to do and learn during practice so that we can make sure that time spent on the field or on the court is productive and fun. And second, it helps us more efficiently communicate with assistant coaches or parent volunteers that might be helping us out what we're actually going to be doing at practice, and that really empowers them to get more involved and deliver more personalized coaching to everybody on our team. So that's why in this section on structuring a practice plan, we're going to cover two key areas. We're going to break down the components of a plan using the PLAN acronym, and then I'm going to show you how to apply this acronym in actually putting together your own practice plan. So let's start off by breaking down a plan. So PLAN stands for purpose, length of time, activities, and necessary resources. This acronym is intended to be used as a tool that can help guide coaches through each component of putting their plan together and make sure they don't miss any important steps. So let's get into what each letter actually means. So purpose. It's important to always start off your plan by stating a specific purpose in which you're hoping to achieve as outcomes at the end of your practice. Now, this really helps guide the decisions we make throughout the remainder of the planning process. So now let's get into the L, length of time. We have to actually decide how long practice is going to be. So depending on the age of your players, this generally ranges anywhere from 60 minutes to 2 hours. So once we've defined the length of time, what we also want to do is break that practice into smaller sections and define a length of time for each of those sections. Now, what that helps us do is if we have a lot of things we're looking to achieve within practice, so your purpose statement has multiple points within it, we can make sure we devote a section of practice to each of those things, helping make sure nothing gets missed during our practice. So now A for activities. So the activities are the things that we're actually going to be doing with players on the field or on the court during our practice. So once we have all of our sections and length of time associated with each, we have to go in and choose and actually write out which activities are going to be taking place during each of those sections of practice. And the last letter is the N, necessary resources. So really what that means is once we've put our plan together, what resources are going to be necessary to actually deliver this plan effectively. So these could be things like, how many assistant coaches do I need to help me run this practice? How many players do I need based on the activities I've selected? What equipment is required? How much space do we need? All those things that really we have to think about before practice if we actually want to give ourselves the best opportunity to deliver this plan effectively. So now that we've covered each of those letters, let's actually go through an example of how we put a plan together following the PLAN acronym. Today I'm going to be putting together a flag football practice plan for kids between the ages of 8 to 9. But even if you coach a different team sport, I really recommend watching this section because a lot of what we go through, you'll easily see how this applies no matter what team sport you're coaching. So let's start off with our purpose. So the purpose I set out for today's plan is to work on some basic defensive, technical, and tactical skills, and then have everybody compete at the end of practice through a big group game and make sure we have fun doing it. And to get a little bit more specific with my purpose statement, I actually defined what defensive, technical, and tactical skills we're going to be working on in today's practice. So we have flag pulling as a technical skill, so a very basic skill used in flag football, and then we have zone defense. Again, another more important tactic we need to actually be able to play a game of flag football. So once I put together that purpose, now I actually have to set out my length of time. So I'm going to have 70 minutes for this practice, and then I broke that 70 minutes down into sections. So I have 10 minutes devoted to my warm-up, then I have 40 minutes devoted to my technical and tactical skills, and then 20 minutes at the end of practice for our group competition. So now let's actually get into the activities that I put together here. So for a warm-up, we have an activity called flag tag, so really fun group game, easy to explain, can get all the kids involved in moving before we start practice. And then once we get into the main sections of practice, the two activities I have are called flag or flee. So this is the one focused on introducing players to the technique of pulling flags. And then we have zone defense 101, where players are actually going to learn the basics of zone coverage. And then I'm also going to set it up so I run those activities simultaneously. So they're going to be both going on at the same time. After 20 minutes, players are going to switch to the other activity so they get to do both. Then following that 40-minute section, we're going to move on to playing a big group game called Capture the Football for 20 minutes. So then players will get to compete against their teammates and apply some of the skills that we learned earlier on in practice. Now that we have all that together, let's look at the necessary resources that I need to actually deliver this plan. So because I want to run two activities sequentially within that main part of practice, I'm going to need at least one additional coach to help me out. So I definitely recommend, if you do have two coaches, try using a station-based format. It just allows you to break players into smaller groups and offer more personalized instruction where we're actually working on the development of skills and tactics. And then also based on the activities I selected, I'm gonna need at least 5 or more players at my practice. Because we're doing zone defense, if I don't have at least 5 players, we're not gonna be able to work on zone defense. So it's going to be very important that I have that, or else I'm going to have to switch up my practice a little bit. And then in terms of equipment, I need flag belts and footballs. And for the necessary space, because capture the football is a big group game, I'm going to need at least a field that's about 50 yards long by 30 yards wide. So that's just a quick example how we actually follow the PLAN acronym to put together our own practice plan. So make sure you download the Athlete Era app for your sport and try putting your own plan together following this acronym. The ability to choose quality drills and activities is one of the most important skills that can separate good coaching from great coaching. The activities that we run during practice need to strike a balance between being both fun and functional. Now, what I mean by that is that they have to be fun so they keep kids engaged, but functional so that that engagement results in the acquisition of new motor skills. So to help you do this in this section of the webinar, we're going to show you the components that make up a great activity using the GREAT acronym. And then to apply this concept, we're going to evaluate 2 activities and decide which is the best one to incorporate into our practice plan. So let's dive into it. GREAT stands for gamification, repetitions, easy to modify, age appropriate, and time. Now, using this acronym will give us a tool as coaches to help evaluate what are actually quality drills and activities that should be added into our plan. So now let's go through and review each letter within the acronym. So gamification. Does the activity contain common components of gamification that are specific to our sport? So these are things like having a point system, making sure there's rules, whether they be simple or more complex. And lastly, making sure there's an element of competition. So this could be either competing against myself or competing against my teammates. Repetitions. It's important that activities maximize the number of repetitions for each individual player based on the actual skill we're looking to develop within that activity. Now, a couple easy ways to help increase the number of repetitions are to pick activities that don't eliminate players, and also ensure you pick activities and structure them in a way that you limit the number of kids that are standing around in line. So now E, easy to modify. We want to pick activities that once we're on the field and running them can be quickly changed within 5 to 10 seconds. A lot of times what's going to happen is we're going to start running an activity and find out it's either too simple for my players or it's way too complex. And we want to be able to quickly modify the activity to meet players where they're at. And this will help keep them engaged without requiring us as coaches to completely move on and explain a brand new activity. Now let's get to the A, age appropriateness. So activities a lot of times that are appropriate for a high school athlete may not actually be appropriate for a kid that's between the ages of 5 to 12. A 6-year-old is at a very different point from a cognitive and a physical development standpoint than a 16-year-old. And as coaches, we always have to account for this when we're selecting our activities. Now T, time. So how long is it going to take to set up this activity? How long is it going to take to explain this activity? And how much time did we actually plan to devote to this activity based on the time we allocated to that section of practice? It's very important to review these things to make sure the activity we choose will then actually fit well within our practice plan structure that we've came up with. Now that was a lot of information to go over, but I'm going to teach you a little bit of a shortcut. Look for something called small-sided games. These are simple competition-based activities typically done with between 2 to 5 players. Now they're well backed in research because they can increase the number of repetitions players get, helping facilitate skill development, and they also create an environment that's much more game-like. So look, and really I do recommend adding these into your practice plans. So now that we've gone through that acronym, let's actually see how we can apply this. So in the next section, we're going to look at 2 different activities and evaluate them using the GREAT acronym to pick the best one to incorporate into our plan. Now that you've learned the GREAT acronym, I'm going to show you how to apply this acronym when trying to pick out activities to add into our practice plan. So for this example, we're going to say that I'm coaching basketball for kids between the ages of 8 to 9, and I really want to emphasize dribbling within my plan. So I found two potential activities that I could add. One is called Through the Gates, and the other is called Gears Dribbling. So to run through the gates, I would set up cones as gates on the court and then have every player get a basketball. And when I say go, players have 30 seconds to dribble through as many gates as possible, earning a point each time they pass through a gate. And whoever gets the most points at the end of 30 seconds wins. For Gears Dribbling, I'm going to separate players into two groups, have each group line up on the baseline, and every player will have a ball. When I say go, players are going to dribble to half court and back. Now, as they're dribbling, I'm going to call out different gears. Each time I call out a gear, players will change their speed according to that gear. So those are the two activities I could potentially add. Now let's go through and look at them with each component of the GREAT acronym to see which is the best activity for me. So for gamification, it's easy to see that Through the Gates wins this one. It has a point system and an element of competition, whereas Gears Dribbling doesn't have any elements of gamification. Now for reps, both of these activities really do maximize the number of reps players are getting when it comes to the skill of dribbling. So neither of them have a lot of lines or eliminate players or any of those sorts of bad things that decrease the number of reps. Now, when it comes to easy to modify, I think that there's a lot more opportunity here to modify and change Through the Gates in comparison to Gears Dribbling. Because Through the Gates is more of a game with an open environment, I could more easily modify this activity by adding a simple rule. So an example of this would be, okay, now every single time a player steals an opponent's ball, they earn an extra point. So that's just a quick example of a modification I could make to that activity. So now when it comes to age appropriateness, I believe both of these would be appropriate for kids 8 or older. So I wouldn't go any younger than that because we're asking players to dribble with speed and change direction. This is quite a few skills in combination, so it might not be appropriate for players that are brand new to the game of basketball. Now when we look at time, so I wanted to work on dribbling for 20 minutes within my plan. I think both of these activities can definitely be set up and explained within that time, but I think Through the Gates is going to be more engaging for that entire time period. Because it does have elements of gamification, I've thought of some ways I could modify it. I can keep it engaging for that entire 20-minute section of practice. So that was just a quick example of how we actually apply the GREAT acronym and really compare activities to pick the best one for our practice plan as a coach. Now, if you like that activity and want more activities that follow the GREAT acronym, be sure to download the Athlete Era app for your sport following this webinar. We have lots of great options in there for you as a coach. Now, a plan is only as effective as its execution once we get to practice. So that's why in this section, we're going to cover how to deliver fun and effective practices for kids. To do this, we're going to dive into two main topics. The first one is actually defining what makes sport fun for kids. And then for the second topic, we're going to run through some general tips and guidelines on what you can do before, during, and after practice to deliver the best sports experience for every kid on your team. So let's get into it. Now, the word fun gets thrown around in youth sport a lot, but a lot of times as coaches, we're not really provided any additional context in terms of what can we actually do to make sport more fun for all the players on my team. Luckily, lately, there's been more research done in this area, and it's really helped us to identify key areas that drive fun within youth sport. So the three fundamental areas that I want to look at right now are sportsmanship, effort, learning, and improving. So sportsmanship, this is really the social domain. So when we're talking about sportsmanship, it's all about how are players interacting with other players on our team. Are they being positive? Are they being supportive and helpful of one another? And are they cooperating with each other during games and activities? When we have good sportsmanship, it really creates a positive team environment, which makes sport more fun for kids. Now, the second one is effort. So this is really the internal domain. So how hard are all my players trying at practice? When we're putting in our own best effort and trying our hardest at things, it makes sport more enjoyable for everybody involved. And now the last one is learning and improving. So kids have reported having more fun in sport when they have the opportunity to learn multiple positions. And as we improve and overcome challenges, it helps us build confidence. And let's face it, sport is challenging. And the more we can overcome these challenges within sport, the more enjoyable of an experience it becomes. So when we look at these three areas, we really want to focus on these things and what we can do to influence them as coaches. So now let's actually get into some tips and guidelines on what we can do before, during, and after practice to hit on these three areas and really drive a great experience when delivering our plans. Now let's cover 3 quick tips for things that you can do as a coach right before practice starts to help your plan run more smoothly. So first off, make sure you set up as much equipment as you can before practice actually starts. This will just help you have smooth transitions between activities and keep a good flow to your practice. Second, make sure you check in with your assistant coaches to ensure that they know what the plan is and what they'll be doing throughout the entire duration of practice. This just helps make sure that once practice starts running, you can focus your time on your players and not necessarily focus a lot of time on helping your assistant coaches. Now, the last thing, if parents are going to be watching practice, make sure to communicate with them and set out some basic guidelines and boundaries. This just helps prevent parents from becoming disruptive as our practices are running. Now that we've covered that, let's get into more details on what we can do during practice to deliver great coaching. Now let's cover a few basic things that we can do as coaches during practice to make sure our plans are delivered effectively. So the first one is communication. We really want to listen to how players are communicating with each other during activities as well as between activities to see if they're demonstrating signs of positive sportsmanship. So are they supporting one another? Are they using positive language? These things will really help us identify whether or not we've created a positive team environment. Now, when it comes to actually learning and improving various skills, there's a simple process we can follow as coaches. It's called watch it, try it, master it. So what watch it really refers to is we always want to provide players with a visual demonstration of the new skill we want them to try. This is very critical to help start the learning process. Once we've provided that demonstration, get players trying the skill as soon as possible. They're going to be excited to try out what they just watched, and we shouldn't stop them from exploring the new movement. Once they're trying the skill, help them master it by providing 1 or 2 simple cues along the way that's specific to that player's performance and can help them achieve more success. Now, the next thing we want to do during practice is make sure that we have an eye for effort. So when activities are going on, make sure we really focus on how hard players are trying and if they're doing their best, because we want to make sure that they're engaged at all times. So having an eye for effort as a coach will also help us identify when does this activity need to be modified. If players are putting in their best effort and still aren't having a lot of success, this is a great indication that us as coaches need to step in and switch up the activity a little bit. Or if players aren't really putting in a lot of effort and they're seeing a lot of success, this is a good sign that the activity is too easy and we need to change it and make it more difficult. And the last piece, don't be afraid to deviate from your plan. You're going to have a plan, but things aren't going to go the way in which you intended it, and that's okay as a coach. A lot of times, we just have to go with the flow of practice. So if things are going super well, feel free to spend a little bit longer on an activity, or vice versa. If that activity just isn't working, don't feel like you have to spend another 10, 15 minutes doing it just because that's what you had in your section of the plan, but feel free to have a quick water break and move on to the next activity. Now let's cover a few basic things that we can do post-practice as a coach. So once practice wraps up, I recommend bringing players together for a quick 5-minute team huddle. Now during this time, we can do two important things as coaches. We can collect feedback, and then we can also use it as an opportunity to reinforce what players learned and what positive progress they made during that practice. So when it comes to feedback, we can ask players things like, what did you enjoy most about today's practice? What's one thing you would change? What are you most looking forward to at next practice? And this really helps create two-way communication between us and our players. And then in terms of reinforcing what we've learned, again, we always want to make sure that our players know that they've gotten better every single practice. Or we want to make sure to reinforce things like positive sportsmanship. So if a player, demonstrated great sportsmanship at practice, make a point of mentioning that to everybody else to help reinforce that positive culture. Now, the last thing we can do as a coach once everybody's gone home is make sure to spend a bit of time reflecting on practice. So put down a couple quick notes. What went well? What would you change? What was some of that feedback you got from your players? This will make sure that we can take this information and really bring it into when we go to make our next practice plan and consistently improve as a coach. We're going to wrap up today's webinar by briefly reviewing everything that you've learned throughout this session. So we started off by covering the core components of what goes into making a practice plan, and then we introduced the PLAN acronym. Again, that PLAN acronym stands for purpose, length of time, activities, and necessary resources. And this is really intended to be a tool that coaches can use when making their own practice plans. From there, we moved on to looking at how we choose great activities to actually run during our practices. And to help you do that, we went through the GREAT acronym. And GREAT stands for gamification, reps, easy to modify, age appropriate, and time. And again, this can be used as a tool to help evaluate what quality drills and activities should be added into my practices. Then we concluded by really going through the delivery aspect of practice. So we looked at what makes sport fun. And again, some of those main components were sportsmanship, effort, learning and improving. And then we covered some tips on what coaches can do before, during, and after practice to deliver great coaching. So I really hope that you find this information helpful and are excited to implement a number of the things that you've learned today. So that concludes our webinar, and make sure that you download the Athlete Era app for your sport for additional resources and tools to help make great coaching easy.